Okay, we'll start. So this morning, we're discussing Herodotus' Histories, which I know from speaking to people preparing, many of you found it a great read. It's fascinating historically, and also covers many of the themes of this weekend's Academy. So without any further ado, Angus.
Thanks, Geoff. Okay, so yesterday we did tragedy, incest, blinding, death, and today we're going to do World War. So it doesn't really get any better, but I'm going to try and pick up some of the themes that were coming out yesterday and talk a bit about how history gets started. I think a lot of the content hopefully is familiar in one way or another, but I want to ask a question about how does history appear at that point in distant century Athens. I think some of the things we were talking about yesterday in terms of how can the tragedy of ever stop, how can we escape the necessity for generation to fight generation, Greek to fight Greek and Greek to fight Persian, how can that process be put to an end, I think is something very germane to these histories. The ongoing conflict and stasis that we were discussing yesterday is very much there. And there's clearly a great interest in the question of how can we live together? What sets of customs, nomoi, laws, ways of being together can perpetuate for more than one generation? And as we know, Herodotus gives us a vast survey of lots of different ways of living, lots of different customs, some the opposite of the Greek, some very peculiar. And there's a question in that saying, how can people who are free, and we get examples of people who choose their customs, how can they still live together in an orderly fashion and not fight each other? How can, the question that was asked in Oedipus, how can one generation set the next free? It's also a question about how the present generation can decide to accept what the previous one determined. So the way of living of your fathers, how can that become something that's passed on and inherited rather than rejected every time? Which I suppose is a question of how freedom can become authoritative. And the last thing I want to try and pick up as we go through this, you'll find it lots and lots of times, is the question of how good planning and good reasoning and going through the possibilities of action before you act can sometimes allow you to get the right result and not just set in chain a process of events that ends up recoiling back on you, as we saw in Sophocles. And of course we've gone through a movement in these 3 sessions, very briefly, from Homer, the great epic story of war, to Sophocles, the dramatic, tragic story of life, to Herodotus, the first historian, and as it happens, the first historian of a huge war between the Greeks and the Persians. But I thought I'd start with a couple of quotes from spy literature, because history can be a process sometimes of trying to unravel a mystery. In John le Carré's The Honourable Schoolboy, one of the heroes is called Gerald Westerby, Jerry, and at one point he addresses himself. Gerald Westerby, he told himself, you were present at your birth, you were present at your several marriages, and at some of your divorces. And you will certainly be present at your funeral. High time in our considered view that you were present at certain other crucial moments in your history. So Jerry is somebody who's sort of there by accident a lot of the time, just wanders up, maybe by duty. But sometimes obviously you have to do a bit more than just turn up. Being there is not enough. Sometimes you have to actually choose to be there. And when you do, there's a possibility of making a little bit of history, making some sense of your life and of the world. Making history is more than just recording the facts of what happened. Only some facts are actually significant. Only some facts are historical, and that's only true from a certain point of view, a certain perspective. Now, The Honourable Schoolboy, as you know, is the sequel to Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. In that novel, the mole is uncovered in the circus, British Secret Intelligence, by George Smiley. And in the next book, The Honourable Schoolboy, Smiley is trying to get on the trail of Carla, the Russian mastermind. And the process he adopts is one of getting a lot of people together called burrowers to go through case histories. And what they're trying to find out in the case histories, some of which are reliable and some of them were fed to them by the mole, is by the process of comparing these, he's trying to find out what Carla was willing to reveal and therefore what he was hiding. And this is a process called taking back bearings. Now, Smiley balances this out and tries to work out what Carla's really trying to do. And I think, in some senses, this is the method taken by Herodotus. It's a history as a process of taking back bearings, sifting through a lot of accounts, talking to a lot of people to try and find out how things get started. And he's always obsessed throughout the question of origins. Time and time again, these are the first people to invent language, these are the first people to eat their fathers, you know, there's a whole process. These are the first people to use writing, always asking that question, how did it start? A real obsession with causes of things. The other thing I would mention from The Honourable Schoolboy is that when Smiley and his team of burrowers managed to take a correct back bearing, they say that that means that surprising doors of opportunity would open, and it would put the circus in a position to act and not merely react. So if you can get an accurate view of history, there's a possibility sometimes of enabling action to be taken with a view to the future, giving you a better chance of a desired outcome. So in terms of looking at Herodotus' histories, I want to try and see how he talks about action and in what sense men are free to determine their future and to what degree they're locked into a chain of cause and effect, whether that be their circumstances in terms of their nature, social, political, even divine. History always requires some theory of causation of how action leads to outcome, and this story of the war between the Greeks and the non-Greeks, the barbarians, is an examination of how that action started and what happened and what might happen tomorrow. I think there's a moral undertone through a lot of the work that's not, that's actually quite explicit. We did talk a bit yesterday about the Greeks' awareness of the problem of freedom, how they were aware of the conventionality of their own conventions, how it was the authority of the way people were living in Athenian democracy was something that you could vote for through a process of democratic contestation, but by that very fact meant it could be overturned tomorrow. And in Herodotus, there's a very famous discussion in Book 3, Chapter 80, between Persian conspirators of Darius about what is the best way to live, what is the constitutional debate, it's called. So, if you remember, Cambyses, the previous king, has invaded Egypt, and he's gone even more loopy as a result than he was, and the Persians need a new king, and they have this debate about what the best form of government would be. One of the advisors, Otanes, argues for democracy. He says that the absolute freedom that a tyrant enjoys inevitably leads him to subvert a country's ancestral customs, to take women against their will, and to kill men without trial. Majority rule, on the other hand, he says, is equality before the law. Now that's often how it's translated. The Greek term is isonomia, which means equally accustomed, equally in a way of life, being together. So everybody takes part in a government like that. The word used is not democracy, but a process of equal custom, equal law, accountable government in which decisions are referred to the common people. Darius is not going to have any of this. He says that the other form of constitution, oligarchy, inevitably leads to faction fighting and stasis, and democracy leads to corruption, and mob rule, which requires a monarch to come around and sort that out for them. So let's just cut to the quick here. Monarchy is obviously the best system. One man got to power because he is the best, he should stay in charge. But he then promptly proves Atani's point about how the freedom of a tyrant subverts ancestral customs by cheating in the contest to decide who's going to become the monarch. They're meant to ride their horses out the next morning, and the first one to neigh as the sun comes up will win. Well, he gets his groom to rig that contest. His very coming to power is predicated on an injustice, a lie, and we've been told that the most important custom of all for the Persians is always to tell the truth. So this man who comes to be absolute tyrant over Persia, his whole rule is predicated on a lie and a denial of custom. He certainly acts decisively, but he acts alone, and the outcome of his actions, as we are to find out, is more than he can handle. Now, I introduced this completely ahistorical scene, which obviously didn't happen. The Persian noblemen didn't have a debate about Greek debates about ways to rule themselves. Herodotus knows it doesn't happen by telling us very emphatically that it did. He says, there are those in Greece who were not convinced of the authenticity of the speeches that were delivered there. But they did take place, they really did. Why does he put it in there? Why does he put in this, this made-up process? I think he makes it up because he's describing the ability of the Greeks to make up the way they live. That in freedom there is a possibility of a debate, saying, is monarchy better than this, or is oligarchy better than that? He needs to signal that he's aware of the ability to make up customs, and he has to situate that in this Persian debate, but also because he wants to put a sort of moral weight on the choice for tyranny as opposed to freedom. What he's doing always is showing us different perspectives, different arguments, clashing, asking each other questions, asking us to decide what the real truth is of the matter. So who was this Herodotus that had these insights? He wasn't an Athenian, although this is a very Athenian history. He was an Ionian Greek from Halicarnassus, which is Bodrum in modern-day Turkey, and he gave public lectures, oral lectures on the wonders that he'd seen on his travels. So he's a bit like a popular TV historian, if you like, a good one, and I actually think that's no bad thing. He'd seen marvels in his travels which forced him to think and to theorize, and he tried to make sense of what had happened. He came to Athens in the 440s BC, and he gave lectures there. Legend has it, by the way, that the young Thucydides, who we're going to talk about and compare to Herodotus, was moved to tears by one of Herodotus's lectures. Sadly, one contemporary classical historian discounts this story on the basis that Thucydides would only have been 10 to 15 years old at the time, presumably because he knows that boys that age never cry. I mean, Athens was an intellectual magnet at the time, and Herodotus would have been drawn there almost naturally, I think, among philosophers and thinkers who were going there. But it was also one of the key cities involved in the histories that he was writing. So he had to go and find out their involvement. But I think we can speculate to a fairly good degree that his time there transformed the work he was writing from similar, but albeit fragmentary histories that were written at the time, which were much more of an ethnographical survey and with a geographical interest. His is quite different from the fragments we have of those, and it is also, as he tells us, heavily reliant on Athenian sources. They get referenced in the histories more than any other source apart from the Egyptians. And I think it is imbued with the Athenian democratic spirit, and its central theme, the organizing principle of the histories, a fight for freedom against tyranny, I think might have been forced upon his work and mind in his time there. He was friends with Sophocles, as I mentioned yesterday. Both of them, I think, show an awareness of men often being in situations whichever way they choose to act, their actions sort of recoil back on them and those close to them. Herodotus echoes Sophocles in many points, saying, for example, human happiness never remains long in the same place. Cities which were great in his own time have become small, and those that were great were formerly small. He's aware of how things change over time, grow and decay. If you look at the famous opening lines of Herodotus, his proem, as it's known, it starts proudly and subjectively with his name, Herodotus Alakanasios. But he then immediately strikes a scientific note. Histories apodixis ede. This is the results of my inquiry. And histories is an inquiry, and apodixis is a setting forth in a scientific way. His purpose is conservative. He wants to make sure that the great deeds of men will not be erased through time. The marvelous and miraculous deeds men do, both those of Greeks and those of barbarians, should not go without fame. They should not be akleia, which is the word we had in Homer. If you remember, kleos is wanting immortality for your words and deeds through being written up in a poem. So he's making a nod to that Homeric tradition there as well. But above all, he wants to know why. Why did the Greeks and the barbarians go to war? What was the aitios, the cause? Who is responsible? Who started the whole thing? And immediately after that introduction, he goes in, the very next line says, according to learned Persian accounts, it was the Phoenicians who caused the conflict. The next chapter begins, according to the Persians, that is how Io came to Egypt. The Greek version is different. Throughout we hear lines like, the Persians say, the Persians think, of course the Phoenicians have a different view of matters, the Egyptians say this, the people from Corinth think this, Athenians think that. And he says that he won't come down in favour of this or that account of events, but will talk about the man, to his certain knowledge, who first undertook criminal acts of aggression against the Greeks, Croesus. And then the story takes off and runs from there. It's a story really of how Persia, if you like, and its act of aggression against Greece was the driver of freedom. A freedom created defensively, if you like, in the unique conditions of Athenian democracy, which otherwise might have not lasted so long. I didn't even know if you read the article by Rafflau, the sort of windy German classicist, but he makes the point that awareness of the positive value of any kind of freedom presupposes a strong and general consciousness of the negative value of the corresponding kind of unfreedom. And that the Persians were kind enough to supply consciousness of unfreedom to the Greeks by the invading them, supplying a vast leak in consciousness. And the victory of freedom, in a kind of miraculous and unexpected victory against Persia, led to Athenian power and empire, the externalization of the freedom of the city over other Greek cities. And it led eventually to war against Sparta. There is no Greek unity that lasts after the Persian Wars, and freedom becomes a problem. How can my city be free while yours is? Athens' very freedom seems to be the spur for Sparta fighting it. Not only is there a war with Sparta, but there is a conservative reaction within Athens to democratic freedom, which I think we discussed briefly yesterday in terms of why do you let all these cobblers and tradesmen make votes on important decisions when clearly the experts should be doing it? Why should all these really poor men who have only got any say in society because they rode in the triremes at Salamis get to decide how we should live? And there's a reaction against Themistocles, the architect and victor of Salamis, who is thrown out of Athens, kind of undermined by oligarchs by 470, but there's ongoing conservative backlash, which I'm going to discuss a bit through that century. And it takes the form of arguing really about, I suppose in a way, about the very process of history. The way the Greeks thought about nature was that nature was immortal. That an acorn tree will die, of course, but it will reproduce itself as another acorn tree, sort of exactly the same, and it is unchanging in that level. Nature is immortal. Man, however, is unnatural in that he is always unique and comes to a full stop. So that's not like anything else in the world. There's something unnatural about man. And so the problem is, how does man and his unnatural self and his unnatural activities become immortalized? That hope of immortality is through history. I won't run through what happens in the book. Just to jog your memory, we have, I'll throw a few names out, Croesus, Cambyses invading Egypt, going mad, Darius, the constitutional debate, invasion of Scythia, Darius invading Europe, Ionian revolt, defeat at Marathon, death of Darius, Xerxes comes to power, another invasion, Thermopylae, Artemisian, Salamis, Xerxes says, I've had enough of this, goes home, Battle of Plataea, Battle of Mycale, all the fighting's over. Xerxes starts stealing other men's wives, as predicted back in Book 3, the wife of Maestes. The Athenians crucify Artaetes before the eyes of his son. And we end with Cyrus again, right back at the beginning, and a story of how the Persians chose to live in a harsh land and rule, rather than to cultivate fertile plains and be the slaves of others. I want to just flag up a bit about the ethnography. I'm not going to go into any of the detail, there's no time, about Scythia and Egypt. It's fascinating stuff, but I'll pick out one much remarked section which shows Herodotus' sort of social constructionism in a way, in his awareness of how customs are created. He says, if one were to order all mankind to choose the best set of rules, nomoi, in the world, each group would, after due consideration, choose its own customs. Each group regards its own as being by far the best. This opinion of one's own customs as being the best is universal. And his example is Greeks won't eat the corpses of their fathers, whereas Indians won't cremate the corpses of their fathers. And he says Pindar, the poet, was right to have said that custom, nomos, is the king of all. And then we have a very important exchange between the Spartan king Demaratus, who is here speaking on behalf of the Greeks, and Xerxes, about why the Spartans are such good fighters. Spartans are good fighters, Demaratus says, one-on-one, but they fight best in groups. They are free, but not entirely so. The law, nomos, is their master, despotes. They fear that more than your men, Xerxes, fear you, because whereas for the Greeks, law is their master. For the Persians, mastery is the custom that they live under. There was an article in the readings by James Redfield about called Herodotus the Tourist, I think, which made a useful distinction between hard and soft cultures, which I think is trying to talk about Herodotus' awareness of the variability of custom and practice. And he says that hard countries, like Scythia, fall short on civility. They're unwelcoming and difficult to visit. Soft cultures are confusing and seductive, easy to get into, but difficult to leave once visited, like Egypt. The centre, on the other hand, by which they mean Ionia and Greece, is a place of change, where the natural mixture is most delicately balanced, a bit like Aristotle's theory that there are hot people and there are cold people, but both extremes can be bad. If you have a mixture in the middle, it's good. In that centre, where cultures are transformed through contact with others, there's a possibility of taking a critical view of what customs you should have rather than having them be fixed. And we see the sort of tragedy of fate unroll in the histories, whereby Cyrus, at the beginning, as a Persian emperor, is hard. He conquers the Medes, who are soft. As a result, the Persians, as it's expressed here, change from the thistle, hard life, to the feast. They take up trade, they take up money, they take up sexual pleasure with boys, which they learn from the Greeks. And we're told that the Persians adopt more customs than anyone else. They invade Egypt, that makes them so soft, the monarchy collapses. And they never want to stop, however. They want to be in a process of taking all customs into one. And it's just worth quoting Xerxes' dream of no limits. He says to his advisors, "We will make Persian territory end only at the sky, the domain of Zeus, so that the sun will not shine on any land beyond our borders. With your help, I will sweep through the whole of Europe to make all lands into a single land. If my information is accurate, once we have eliminated those I have mentioned, there will be nobody left, no town or people capable of offering us armed resistance. And so the innocent will bear the yoke of slavery, along with those who have wronged us." So that's a vision of an unchanging totalitarian universalism. Whether you're good or bad doesn't matter. You're going to be subject to Persian custom. It's swallowed up everything. Mardonius, one of Xerxes' advisors, flatters him, but one dares to speak up, Artabanus, saying, "If opposing views are heard, only then is it possible to decide." Of course, like many wise advisors in Herodotus, he's promptly ignored, but the point is made. Correct choices come out of free deliberation of alternatives. Now, the Greeks, on the other hand, rather than trying to impose one custom to bind them all, are an historical people. They are changing. But they are a bit like the Persians in that they are reckless. They have overweening pride and hubris. And we're not sure if they can avoid the same fate as the Persians in the future. Though we are shown, through a number of examples, the possibility of this. Although the Spartans, who we've been told, obey the law all the time, they don't actually do so. At the Battle of Plataea, we see examples of Spartan insubordination, who refuse to ignore orders. And we're told the Greeks are sometimes bad subordinates because each one thinks himself entitled to his own ideas. They are not loyal to an overlord, but to an idea. Each has made this idea his own. The Persians have a hereditary custom of monarchy. The Greeks, on the other hand, have free institutions and equal nomia, equal custom. And we're told that it's because of that that they win. That among the Greeks, nomos is political rather than cultural, which is why we get examples of being able to rewrite your customs, your nomai. Lycurgus, the Spartan lawgiver, comes in and rewrites the way of life for the Spartans. And Solon, of course, the great Athenian lawgiver, did the same thing, put a new set of rules in place for Athenians, said, look, you've got them now, you're not allowed to change them for 10 years, I'm off, and I'll come back in 10 years and see how you're getting on. That's a very conscious process of changing the way people live. So there seems to be a possibility for the Greeks to have a strong and thoughtful solution at the centre to be critical assimilators of customs, rather than the Persians who just take on all these customs all the time wherever they go in an unthinking way. So there's a chance for the Greeks to experience cultural change as a thoughtful choice among options. And it follows that Herodotus is presenting the critical comparison of cultures itself that he carries out as being a crucial element of Greek culture. To be aware of the system of mankind, then, the argument would seem to be aware of the laws that govern the transformation of custom is in some degree to be free of systematic necessity. it's the hope of history, if you like. Right, I'm going to skip over the bit which describes how the Athenians get freer and freer because they're free. So the tyrants get killed and they start winning battles almost immediately, and it becomes a virtuous circle. We can discuss that. I think it's quite clear in the text about how that happens, because I want to get on to compare Herodotus with Thucydides, because I think we can get a bit of an insight to Herodotus there. Now, as I mentioned, I think there was definitely an oligarchic conservative backlash through the process of the 5th century, accelerating through the Peloponnesian War and ending in tyranny being briefly established and oligarchy being briefly established in Athens. It was a reaction, a conservative reaction against nomos, actually. Custom had become the watchword of Athenian democracy, or Athenian radical democracy, if you like. Isonomia was its the flag, the word on its flag. The word on the flag of the oligarchs was nature, usus, which is opposed to nomos, or custom. Nomos meaning not just law, but any social and political norm, custom, way of life, conventional belief, religious practice, proper ethical conduct of an individual. Its sanction is purely human, and its authority rests only on consensus. Physis, nature, on the other hand, is an unchangeable force which has made things and persons what they intrinsically are. It's the innate, native endowment of the person. And it is also, therefore, a force to which all men are subject. And part of the conservative reaction was to say this isonomia, everybody getting a share in how we live, the only result in that has to be create a stifling conformity, a society that's indifferent to quality and excellence possessed by men of breeding. We see that in Aristophanes' comedies, The Clouds, about 423 BC. In a very famous scene, the figures of right and wrong personified have a debate, and wrong encourages his followers to do as nature bids: skip, jump, laugh, and don't be inhibited by conventional notions, nomidze, of what is disgraceful. So nature can let you break the laws. Thucydides' history, it speaks to a lot of these ideas, I think. He starts his introduction to his histories with a very different approach than Herodotus. I can just find the quote. He starts with his name, just like Herodotus does, but he doesn't present to us the results of his inquiries. He doesn't produce a story that's the result of Thucydides going to talk to lots and lots of people and taking these backbearers, as they call them. Rather, he says that he's written up exactly what happened. The facts speak for themselves, and he says rather aristocratically, I do not write for the tastes of an immediate public. I write for the future and for truth. And I've seen all this happen, and if I wasn't there myself, I spoke to eyewitnesses. He's an evidence-based historian in the language of the common day. He strikingly is not interested in history. He writes about the present. He says, I found it impossible, because of its remoteness in time, to acquire a really precise knowledge of the distant past, or even of the history preceding our own period. Yet, which is not good for a historian. But yet, after looking back into it as far as I can, all the evidence leads me to conclude that these previous periods were no great periods at all, either in war in anything else compared to right now. So I'm going to write about this Peloponnesian War, which is happening, and I took place in because it's the best thing ever. He's a view of nature as being eternal, and he finds natural answers to the reasons for the war and not human and political ones. He doesn't have a political theory of causation. Might always makes right. for Thucydides. I think it's very different to what Herodotus is trying to do, which is much more of a democratic history, if you like, or a history enabled, made possible by democracy, where different perspectives on the truth can be put into a process of comparison and argument. And it reminds me a bit, I'm flicking back and forth slightly now, and losing bits of paper, of what E.H. Carr says in his essay on the study of history, that history is the study of causes. It's a process of always asking why and not what. Thucydides seems to be interested, to me, and this is a broad comparison, but seems to be interested in the what and not the why that Herodotus is interested in. Carr's definition of objectivity in history is that it's possible because the historian rises above his limited vision because he recognizes his involvement in that vision and eschews total objectivity. And secondly, he has the capacity to project his vision into the future, allowing more insight into the past. And Carr quotes an English conservative historian, Namier, as a sort of provocative but interesting statement, saying that it is the job of historians to imagine the past and remember the future. The past throws light on the future, and the future throws light on the past. I think we can see a fair amount of that process actually in Herodotus, who, rather than saying it is necessary that Sparta fight Athens because of growing Athenian power, there are other ways of doing this. Croesus, you remember, invades Cappadocia because he's aware of the Persians under Cyrus beginning to become powerful and wants to try and stop them before they become too great. That's something, a possibility of acting on the future that Herodotus is aware of, that he can use the similarity of past events that have known outcomes and compare them to recent events and be able to investigate causes that might allow us to act in the right way for the future. So he is moralizing and giving warnings. His work is a world-changing, or potentially a world-changing work, and not just a world-describing work. Okay, I'm probably overrunning slightly. 5 minutes? 10?
5 to 20.
So, if you read the article by the classicist de Saint-Croix on Herodotus, an introduction to Herodotus, he actually prefers Thucydides to Herodotus because he feels that Thucydides has a duty when confronted with conflicting evidence to cut through it and sort it out and actually decide which account was right. Whereas Herodotus, in his words, too often just gives us different accounts that he had received and leaves it to us to decide. As Herodotus puts it, I am obliged to record the things I am told, but I am certainly not required to believe them. This remark may be taken to apply to the whole of my account. But I rather like that about Herodotus because it's, in a way, an appeal to our freedom, the freedom of his listeners and readers to decide things, rather than taking this evidence-based history approach which pretends that the things in themselves demand a certain reaction. As I've said, Thucydides isn't even a historian in the sense that we understand it. He doesn't write any continuous history of the past at all, apart from the bit you may have read in his introduction, which is purely conceptual history. It's quite compelling. Its account may be of how civilization has developed up to a current point, but it's not a historical account, it's a conceptual reconstruction. So I think there's a funny situation in that Cicero called Herodotus the father of history, but Cicero didn't seem to notice that Herodotus didn't have any children. There are historians after him, but there's a process of chronicling history, writing down each year this happened, each year this happened, and the annals of history, the record of history, but maybe not history in the sense that we get a glimpse of it in Herodotus. which is an interesting question, and I think some of the readings make the point usefully that how much the philosophers following this period, Plato and Aristotle in particular, have no interest in history whatsoever. The silence of Aristotle on the question of history from a man who talked at great length about everything else is definite. So the question I'm wondering about is whether or not the Athenian democracy and Athenian freedom and that victory against Persia actually made history possible. History is about liberation and freedom is a precondition for winning battles against Persians, and winning is necessary, or actually is memorable action, and action, what men do, is the substance of history. So without freedom you can't act, you can't achieve anything great, the argument seems to be, and individuals and nations can't enter history without freedom, which is why history is written to preserve the defense and acquisition of freedom. It's why this book is about a struggle for freedom. It has to be about freedom because it is history. To conclude then, so I'd like, in the discussion, I haven't got time to do it now, to talk about Xerxes, whether or not he has any freedom to invade, because he does waver and debate a lot before he makes his fateful decision. I just want to end on the Battle of Salamis and Themistocles, and trust me, there's only 2 pages left. So the miracle of Salamis, how on earth does David manage to defeat Goliath? How does the small defeat the big in this sea battle? It is something that appears like a miracle, a surprising door of opportunity, but it's a result of a trick, as we know. Themistocles is having to cope with all this internal discord and disunity among the Greeks. The Peloponnesians are going to retreat to the Peloponnese behind their wall across the isthmus. They're going to abandon the Athenian navy here, and there are all these rows going on the night before. And so Themistocles rigs the result. It's a bit like Xerxes in a way. He sends a messenger over to the Persian camp to trick them. And the messenger says, the Greeks are going to try and make their escape. They're really scared. You better block off the exits on the straits around Salamis, and then you'll have them trapped and can destroy them. And the funny thing about this message to trick the Persians is, of course, that it's true. Themistocles doesn't tell them a lie. The Greeks are scared and about to retreat, and there is an opportunity for the Persians to destroy them. But the Persians fall into the trick of this truth, whatever that means, and block off the exits from Salamis and are ready to destroy the trapped Greeks. And then something miraculous happens. The Greeks suddenly stop all their squabbling, become Greeks, and fight and win. Quite how we don't know. There's a dust cloud that comes over that seems to settle as a moment, but how it happens, it doesn't last long, is what we know. Immediately afterwards, there's a debate about who was the bravest at Salamis. Nobody wins enough first round preference shares, and the second round 8 Miliband result goes to Themistocles, who's very annoyed about the whole thing, and the Greeks can't even honour themselves. They're straight back into fighting. But nonetheless, the remarkable thing here is that Themistocles has created history through his foresight. Not only has he known what will happen if he gives this message to the Persians, but 3 years before, he has directly determined that the Athenians should build a navy, a wall of wood, to defend Greece. And he's sold his interpretation, and he is presented as an overtly political player. He goes around camp to camp saying, you should do this, you should do this, and he's got that ability somehow to look through that door of opportunity, maybe because He's taken back bearings, he knows how to read prophecies, he knows how to make the Greeks unite, and he's a symbol of Athenian freedom that has determined to remain free, and in freedom has the power to deliberate in advance the best course of action to take. So this is freedom, writing the freedom of history. Okay, qualifications on this. The tendency to look back on the Greeks as being the foundation of freedom that we now enjoy in a sort of straightforwardly progressive and linear fashion is a tempting but probably unfounded one. The Greek experience is different. It's the experience of the unfounded nature of freedom, how it just appears out of nowhere, and how it poses itself as a question to them, and how they live through its unraveling. How the victorious small Athens became big Athens and ended up in a reaction against freedom in the name of nature. So it didn't last long. It was an untimely insight, and I think valuable as such to us. The very last word in the Histories is doulouin, to be a slave. We hear that the Persians have chosen to live in a harsh land and rule themselves rather than live softly and be enslaved. Or rather, since this is again counterfactual historical ending to this history, they haven't chosen to live in a hard land and rule. They've chosen to go into a soft land, and they will end up being enslaved. Alexander the Great, Herodotus is not to know this, but they've done something that will result in their loss of freedom. Herodotus probably couldn't be aware of what was going to happen in Athens at the end of the 5th century and through the 4th century, but he did get out pretty quickly and go and live somewhere safe, so he may have had a good idea. He managed to avoid dying in the plague, if nothing else. His histories as containing the possibility of being world-changing and not just world-describing, then holding out the possibility of acting in history rather than being the slaves of nature, are something to hold on to. And I'll just finish with another quote from John le Carré, this time the perfect spy. Sometimes we have to do a thing in order to find out the reason for it. Sometimes our actions are questions and not answers.
Okay, questions?
Pericles' funeral oration is surely one of the most sort of moving, epic, heroic, grand narratives, if you like. It doesn't seem like evidence-based history, and of course it's Thucydides who gives us Pericles. And I sometimes wonder, reading this stuff, if we push too hard at the distinction between Herodotus and Thucydides, and if perhaps we should pull together more. The point you make about being the children of Herodotus, well, maybe Thucydides is his child, but the more important point is there's nothing there for hundreds, thousands of years. That's the key point, and the interrelationship between Herodotus and Thucydides is about an evolving conception of Greek identity, and that problematization that comes from freedom, as you yourself have often flagged up, and the destabilizing consequences of freedom, making for a narrative which is difficult then to pull that together again. So Herodotus gives us that kind of narrative. But Thucydides is a bit of a correction, it seems to me, in time and place, and struggling for a different way of a different kind of self-awareness of what it means to be Greek.
It's actually a similar question, though, because obviously Thucydides is peppered with orations, particularly pre-battle orations. So there's obviously the suggestion that persuasion is an important part of that narrative. Is that correct assessment given?
Okay, a couple more. Jane?
Well, I guess it's actually this authority freedom thing, Angus, and I really love the Herodotus. It was marvellous, and it's very nice when here's this story, and as you say, our account of things you're told rather than believing, and then you may do it, and in many ways you might think, well, that would be really nice if a lot more histories were written like that, and he has no children. But surely, in our modern perception of history, is to say, well, here's an authorial, we sort of slightly again this a postmodern type of history in which there isn't a view of saying, how do I record the past? What is my point? Do you know what, so is that this authority versus freedom debate again? Because surely we do want some authorial voice of history.
Joe?
No, sorry.
No, that's right. Any more, and then I'll bring Angus in on please.
Well, it may be relevant, but maybe a different subject. But the point about Aristotle thinks of dying on history, and I mean the way I just read that Finley piece and the way he said it's quoted Aristotle saying it's I prefer poetry because it's about universal, not particular. I mean, does that pertain to the Herodotus Thucydides distinction that you're painting there, the sort of the why versus the what? Is Aristotle responding more to the what type of history? Because it would seem to me that the questioning, inquiring type of history of Herodotus, I can't see why Aristotle was so down on that.
The first two questions, Stephen, Dave, on the funeral oration and the paired off speeches. Of course, that being, you can take my evidence-based history thing with this slightly, a number of qualifications. There's nothing wrong with having eyewitness accounts in history. They're a useful part of it, and history should have evidence. It's just that the general thrust of his history is that it is a sort of a reading off of the facts as just being true because things are by nature themselves, and they are that way for all time. And he says that if I write this up, it'll be very useful because men being what they are, this is going to happen again the same way, and we'll be able to know what to do. The funeral oration, that may be an eyewitness account. The interesting part of the funeral oration is the way in which it's, I think Frank last year called it a propaganda exercise that fails immediately because it's so transparently propaganda. The point about it is that the only argument by which you should live according to the Athenian customs of being tolerant in private, in public, keeping to the law, being open, loving the beautiful. Each of us is his own master. He's trying to make those customs an Athenian way of being traditional when they weren't. So his only strong argument is you should live this way as if it was the way we'd lived for ages. So he's trying to invent a tradition for Athens at a time when people were aware of its non-traditional character and aware of the fact that it was under huge pressure through the war. So exactly what Thucydides thinks of Pericles, pro or against, is a vexed question. But he does present in the funeral oration something of a bit of an airy-fairy argument, an as-if argument compared to very hard arguments that are made in the pairs of opposing speeches about what we should do. The Chameleons Dialogue is the famous one. And the paired off speeches do have, I think, a bit of a formal character to them. Here's my position, here's your position, all right, we're going to kill you. There's not really a debate going on. There's a funny example of the same form of thing in Herodotus after the Battle of Salamis, done by Themistocles. He's a bit annoyed about coming into this Meliband position and wants to get some money, so he goes off and attacks various Greek islands that were siding with the Persians during the war. And he goes to the island of Andros, and the way it's described is in a very Thucydidean way. The Greeks, under Themistocles, come with two great gods to back them up, the gods persuasion and compulsion. The people on the island of Andros have two great gods on their side, poverty and insufficiency. And the argument here they make is that the might of Athens, however strong it is, will never be greater than Andrean impotence. Now, this is clearly a jibe in some form at the way Thucydides presents the arguments of might and right, kind of problematizing that. I just think there isn't the same human element in the formal speeches that are put up, but I know that position is certainly open to debate. I'm just trying to make a broader point around it. In terms of authorial voice, I'm not saying that its history in Herodotus' history is an anything goes relativist account. There is a strong authorial voice, and he does step in at a number of points to state his account. But more than that, he has strongly constructed the whole thing to tell a certain story about freedom and democracy. So there is a very clear authorial narrative and a moral narrative about morality, about being free, that he's making. Somebody usually makes the point, I think in the introduction to the book, about why does he have all these digressions all the time? And the argument made there, which I found convincing, is that he allows himself to wander off the thread all the time because of the necessity to hear other points of view, what others have said. So it's Xerxes who's the type of person who thinks he doesn't need to hear what other people have said, that he's in control over the flow of events. Herodotus' style is itself, and this is what the guy in the introduction argues, is itself avoiding the assumption that what is important to kings should take prominence within the narrative unfolding. That in this narrative, potentially everything is important and interconnected, and you have to decide a lot of the time what's connected. However, I don't think he's saying, it's all interconnected in a kind of sort of postmodernist way. He's also directed it in quite a clear fashion. On Aristotle, poetry and universal, I think that it is Herodotus that he's objecting to in terms of history, because the universal for Aristotle is eternal and unchanging, whereas Herodotus shows a process of the variability of human custom and the particularity of history, rather than poetic truths that last forever, because they speak to the essence of man and his universal nature. There was the man who taught Thucydides was a figure called Antiphon, who was one of the leaders of the oligarchic coup in 411 or so, called the Rule of the 400. And we have a text written by him called On Truth, which says, by nature we are all equally equipped in every respect to be barbarians and Greeks. So he denies a kind of customary or national difference. We're all the same, because we all breathe, we all laugh, we all have eyes and ears. And what's wrong is when the laws are used and customs are used to bind to this strong. Laws really are just fetters on our nature, and the better way of things would be for the strong, who are few, to rule the weak, who are many. And that's taken as a universalist attack on individual freedom, which varies either the freedom of an individual or an individual city or an individual nation, which all vary in their different ways and don't conform to a universal pattern. That's I think it's a big broad intellectual shift, an attempt to naturalize society rather than let it stay customary and unique. And I'm probably doing a gross inadequacy to Aristotle to shoehorn me into that category, because he's many things. But just as a way of starting to think about the problem, I find it useful to make a distinction between your Protagoras, Sophocles, Herodotus on the one hand, and your Euripides, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Xenophon, the voices of conservative reaction who come later. At a very, very broad level.
I was wondering about this question, the idea you seem to bring forward that there's a peculiar freedoms that were being experimented with in Athens, which led to making history. There was some particular unique planning and foresight in what they did, because you could also find plenty of counter-examples of planning, foresight, ambition among the Persians, for example. The fact that they secured the best sources of horses and had alliances with the best navy. They conquered the known world, and I wonder whether it's how far we can really go with the idea that it's the kind of noble planning of the Greeks and kind of the low cunning of the Persians enabling them to get away with things, because yes, you can get that from Herodotus, but that's a history written by the Greeks. So I'm wondering whether exactly what is the uniqueness about what the Greeks did, what Themistocles did. Couldn't you just say the same about some of the great victories and achievements of the Persians as well?
Steve?
This might be a bit of a tangent, but I was just wondering if you could say something about the value of the Spartans to some 20th century people like Rosa Luxemburg, Carl Leibniz, people on the left there, and if that tells us anything about the valuing of equality, perhaps to the exclusion of liberty, or what the relationship there is.
Joe?
Yeah, I was just on this Aristotle issue, because I was just going through the from last year, and I wrote down that he always looked at the true cause of things to be sought in the end and not in the beginning. It kind of fits into this idea of he's looking at what has happened rather than looking at what caused what's happened. And it's something that's kind of been bubbling around and from the session yesterday morning on Marxism. This idea that actually a search for the universal is a conservative thing now. I'm probably talking, being very broad about it, but it just strikes me that one of the things that Aristotle, avoidance of true discussion of history seems to be doing is, because he is looking for the universal when he's, and believes in the natural, he can't deal with the uncertainty of history. And that's what actually Athens does represent. It represents the uncertainty of history, which is why we end up, and the uncertainty of freedom, which is why we end up with this discussion, because this is another thing that's been bubbling over in my mind, is this discussion of hubris, which came up yesterday in that session I was grasping onto at the end of yesterday with Kierkegaard. This idea that there's a very fine line between holding it all together, holding that freedom together, and hubris. And if you try and hold it together through the universal, you lose it. But if you go too far with hubris, you come to hyper, you lose it as well. Which is which then got me thinking. I feel like I'm going all over the place here, but it then got me thinking about the other point that you made, that they could only see their freedom through the unfreedom of the Persians. And so we're struggling with trying to hold on to it, trying to make sense of it. And actually the bravest thing that you can do with it, which is why Herodotus is so important, is to say that, you know, it is what it is. You cannot create a universal out of it. And you can only say why you can only look into the past to say, you know, what it is that caused it, and it was man's actions that caused it. But you can't actually then you can't create a universal out of it. You can't get anything.
Questions getting easier.
I'll take a couple more in this round and then Angus is not sure.
Angus is saying, I think, that Herodotus says that after not really getting their act together at all, the Greeks had this miraculous military victory, and that it seems that they established the reason for that victory, which they can't explain very well, on the sudden sense of freedom. And possibly couldn't the Greeks have actually worked quite hard at what freedom might be? There's that bit in Histories where on Egypt, I've forgotten the name of the city, but they're holding some games and they want them to be the fairest games there can be. They want to have no argument amongst anybody who takes part in the games that they've in any way made it unfair to all their visitors. And they show them all the facilities and they say, this is what we've done this and that. And the Egyptians just say, that's ridiculous. The only way you can make it fair is by you lot not actually competing. Which they're a bit taken aback by. So, you know, it does seem a bit miraculous, and possibly that Herodotus is putting a sense of freedom that results from an unlikely victory, kind of putting it back onto the Greeks before they actually had it. So because it's not a very good account of a battle, is it? Whether it's Thermopylae or Salamis or any other, it's not a very, you can't see kind of a military kind of description of what's actually happened. So it does suggest these kind of, what the bits that he has made up, he's made them up to make the narrative that you're suggesting he's completed.
Greg and then Angus.
The problem with freedom is it not that it's open-ended and therefore disconcerting. And when Athens is abandoned, flattened by the Persians, by I think it's Darius, you know, an expected take on that would be a conservative one, really. But is it not surprising that Herodotus has got a quite liberal take on it? You know, an expected take would be a conservative one, saying, look what we've done, we've abandoned our capital, it's been completely burned, and let's pull down the hatches. But it doesn't, and you know, it's a very kind of open-ended, very positive take. Perhaps it's an accident. His take is the exception to the rule. Maybe Thucydides is the expected version or standard.
So in terms of Persian counter examples, Martin, don't they show cunning and foresight as well? To a degree, and yes, it's true that this is a history written by a Greek. History always seems to be written by the winner. I don't take that as being a criticism, because losers are losers. Really, there's a reason that winners are winners, and the fact that you win doesn't make something not true. You know, the other guy can beat about it, but could have done better in a way. What is unique, though, are two things in terms of the Greeks. One is their freedom. We're told that throughout. And while the Persians do put a little bit of planning into some things, they, at the key moment, really don't, which is Xerxes' decision to make the invasion. So he says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to conquer the entire world, here we go, and all his advisors say, brilliant plan, Chief, we're with you. And one of them, Artabanus, I think it is, says, Well, you might be right, but why don't we just make sure of it? Why don't we allow a bit of time to pass, and we'll examine all the possible ways of dealing with this. We'll take a risk-based approach and lay out all the options and take the best course, and in a bit of time we'll get a bit wiser and have more information, and then if you still want to act, then fair enough, but we'll be in a better position and more control of what we do. And more or less, Xerxes says, no, we can't possibly do that. I can't sit around going through every course of action. I'm a king. I have to act. And he's under some sort of historical necessity to do so, otherwise he wouldn't be great King Xerxes, which is sort of a tragic moment. He then, of course, regrets this, and he spends a night tossing and turning with strange dreams and not sure what to do, and he's not going to do it, and everybody's very happy, but then the dream comes back and he's going to have to do it. So the thing that he wanted to do in the first place, but then the good advice made him not sure about, he's now being told is necessary, because the custom of the Persian kings is to have war with other people and to spread unfreedom, so he must do that. And it's only at the crossing of the Hellespont that he really internalizes. He says, that necessity of being Persian, I make my necessity. And the sort of whole tenor of the book changes then. He gives the Hellespont a good thrashing at that point, gets the whip out. But as the Persian army comes down through Greece, the whole tenor of books 7, 8, and 9 changes. There's a lot more rape and slaughter, and it's not quite a happy story in a way that we had certainly in books 1 to 5 as different characters. On Rosa Luxemburg, maybe slightly a stretch too far on the Spartans' equality and liberty. The Spartans became a important symbol closer to this time for conservative thinkers, for Plato, and for lots of people after him. Sparta was held up as the model of a good constitution, law-obeying people who managed, and the Roman historians are saying this, who managed to stay the same way for 800 years. Stay the same way is a really boring rural cultural backwater for 800 years. We're never having that brief moment of glory that Athens was. And in terms of the way Herodotus talks about it, although at times he uses them to stand in for Greek spirit, the Greek spirit doesn't really exist, but he has to do that. And sometimes he gives us the great contrast between Thermopylae, which is my duty unto death, and Salamis, which is the Athenian freedom, the discord, the arguing, and the political manipulations put together. So there is within it a bit of a different view being taken of the two cultures, but it's not a heavily developed one, because at the end of the day the Spartans are allies in this war against Persia, which is more important maybe. I think Sean, you're just absolutely right. Freedom is understood retrospectively because of this event. It makes lots more sense because of this victory, and it's written backwards from that point. That I think is just how these things happen often. Why is there not, Craig, a reaction when the Persians burned down Athens not once but twice, and why don't the hatches go down there? Well, because I suppose it was their plan to have the Persians burn down Athens. I mean, it wasn't an unexpected tragic outcome. They fully knew that was going to happen. They say, let's leave, and we'll take this almighty gamble on this navy we built yesterday. Against all these Persians, because we're, pretty confident, pragmatic risk takers. So they wouldn't, I think, be that bothered about the city being burnt down. The Persians stole the famous statuette group of the mythical founders of Athenian freedom, the tyrant killers, Herodotus and Aristogeiton, which stood in the marketplace, the Agora. Persians stole that in 480, took it back to Susa or wherever. Athenians just built a new one and carried on. And that story of the blow struck for freedom against the tyrant back in 514 became, a popular drinking song. And the tradition continued. It's interesting though with Thucydides, he rewrites that story of...
It's not an alarm. They're trying to sort it out, basically. So we just have to live through it.
Thucydides tries to rewrite that story of the Tyrannosaurs, which we find in this. He demolishes that myth, he demolishes the popular myth. He said this wasn't a political struggle for freedom at all. There was just some jealousy going on. The tyrant was in love with one of these guys, and the other guy was jealous, and then he insulted his sister, and so they killed him. So Thucydides tries to rubbish this sort of story. Aristotle goes along with that as well, and amplifies it, saying that the Athenian citizenry involved in this democratic coup weren't even armed. So he just tries to make it a random result of a bad love, rather than a political vote for freedom, which is more in Herodotus's camp. Right, so the universalisms of being conservative, hubris, freedom and unfreedom. Aristotle looking to the end and not the beginning is not great for a historian. I think historians should look to the beginning and write from there in many ways, which is what Herodotus's answer is. Universalism being conservative, yes, in a sense. I mean, in this sense it is, because it's a process of trying to naturalize what is otherwise different. So what is different in human life is a result of people choosing to live differently according to different customs. The attempt to naturalize society that says we all live like this because some of us are strong and some of us are weak, denies the role of the individual in history, tries to deny what is different about it, tries to flatten out history, tries to create a totalizing system, which is Xerxes' vision of the entire world, innocent and guilty, free and unfree, still nonetheless subject to a higher power, which is his nature, or Persian truth. So I think the problem about hubris, you're absolutely right. We're shown all the time that there is in the language of the day, a tipping point that freedom can lead to a destabilizing effect, can provoke reactions against it, can become anarchic. Free discussion can turn into license. All that stuff they say about democracy might go into corruption and mob rule. Yes, these things do happen, they're not just made up. I think, to try and link it to the Kierkegaard session in one sentence, there would be the thinking that Kierkegaard and people like John Stuart Mill at more or less the same time have is that our problem is when opinions and insights into ways of living, insights we have into human truth. Our problem is when they harden up into received dogma, when they become prejudices rather than living truths that we challenge and try and explore all the time, because we bring a lot of different perspectives to them. So the call there is for the true Christian not to accept Christianity as being true because it's handed down as true, because that's just a passive acceptance of somebody else's truth, and it's not a truth for you. For J.S. Mill, he thinks the problem in society is the non-heretical people, the absence of enough heretics who allow again, human truths to solidify and become natural. So we all have to be sort of individual to get a grasp on truth. So the more heretics, the better.
Okay. Right. Any time for a few final points. Also, as this is the last discussion on the Greeks, anything you've been desperate to say? Geoff.
Yeah, sure. I wonder if you could just say more about Herodotus' conceptions of sort of cultural interactions, because it seems to me that there's a moderate sort of clash of cultures in the sense of, and that I think Herodotus deals in one way with the contested and ever-changing anti-conventional nature of Athenian culture by positing it against sort of a Persian way of life, and that hides some of the insecurities of the Greek way of life in a way. And he also says, I think, as he said, when the Persians try to take on the customs of others, that is ruinous for what can be damaging to a society. But at the same time, if you read the book on Egypt, he steps in and says that there are many points in which the Egyptians invented these things which we Greeks have. So there's a sense of passing on the torch, certain cultural innovations which other cultures do take on. There seems to be sort of two strands which are not necessarily contradictory, but are in some tension. That's all.
Okay, that's Steve.
I just wanted to pick up on that point about Kierkegaard and Mill and the need for heretics and the dangers of dogma, and how that seems to suggest a direct parallel between Herodotus and Socrates as well. And I think Collingwood makes this point explicitly. He says the parallel between the work of the two men is striking. But the other thing Collingwood said is that he asks about Thucydides, and he says, why does this man write like this? And he says, I think he's got a bad conscience. That's his phrase, got a bad conscience. I asked myself, well, why? Why does Thucydides have a bad conscience at the time? Because only a few years separates them, doesn't it, these two historians? So if you could just say a wee bit about that, the mood, the period in which Thucydides is writing it down.
Okay, any final points? Okay, Joe, the last word.
Just a question. Why do they have this need for a man to be immortal? That's a question.
In terms of Darren's point about clash of cultures, clash of civilizations, yeah, two things on that. One, that as I was arguing, there can be an unthinking taking on of customs, and there could be a critical taking on of customs. So we think we see the Greeks as doing a pick and choose out of customs and taking good ones. So that way of ordering the gods, no, not quite, we'll invent our own one, but thanks for the tip-off that we can create a theogony, that's useful. This letter writing thing, definitely, we're just going to take that lock and stock and barrel. Urinating sitting down, no. It's nonsense, we'll leave that to the Egyptians. So there's an awareness of you can pick and mix, which is important. But there's one thing at the bottom that is not up for negotiation. So this isn't just a cultural relativism that says, you've got your customs, you've got ours, let's rub along nicely. One of these people has a set of customs which is despotism. One has freedom, and they're not up for negotiation. And that's very clear throughout. Herodotus and Socrates maybe have to do another day. There are numerous Socrates and versions of them. But I think you need to go a little bit deeper than say they both ask questions about things. Because Socrates asks questions in a particular way. And quite irritating way often to pick through to the real truth. Herodotus may not have the same idea of the real truth, though he does ask questions. As for Collingwood and the unhappy conscience of Thucydides, he would say that when he's a Hegelian. We had all that last night. But in terms of the different position that they're in, Herodotus is not an Athenian. he's terribly grateful to Athens because of its role in freeing Ionia from Persia. He's a recipient of freedom, and he goes to Athens and he finds out a lot about it and works into his histories. Thucydides is the son of a wealthy Thracian mine owner with a lot of aristocratic connections, possibly by blood to the Thracian royal family, who's in Athenian society and doesn't like what's going on, is particularly critical of the handling of the war, as we discussed the other day, and incompetence, although he himself had been booted out for sort of incompetence himself. So that maybe is his unhappy conscience, victim of his own failure. Why do men have a need to be immortal? It's sort of inescapable, isn't it? I mean, it's a product of what Roger called your perspective being on the edge of the world, and everything else is before you. You are immortal already, you know that. Your death is not something that you can think through and conceive. Slavery is something that can happen to you in life, however, and Herodotus may be a good guide to living that life in freedom rather than according to somebody else's rules.
Okay, thank you very much, Angus.